At a recent meeting between the Alachua County Commission and the Gainesville City Commission, the subject of the Cabot-Koppers Superfund Site came up. We're joined today by Dr.John Mousa, who is currently the Pollution Prevention Programs Manager for the Alachua County Environmental Protections Department. Dr. Mousa has been with Alachua County for 10 years. Dr. Mousa earned a PhD from the University of Florida in 1973 in analytical chemistry and a Bachelor of Science degree with highest honors in chemistry in 1970 from the University of Houston. Dr. Mousa is also a certified public manager in the state of Florida. Prior to joining Alachua County, Dr. Mousa was employed for 20 years with the Environmental Science and Engineering, Inc., an environmental engineering consulting firm in Gainesville. He served as Vice President and Laboratory Director for ESE. Dr. Mousa also served as an industrial research analytical chemist with the DuPont Company in Wilmington, Delaware. And thank you for joining us, John.
Glad to be here, Mark.
John, as we go into this conversation, why don't we start with a little geography and just tell us where the Cabot-Koppers Superfund Site is located.
Okay, Mark. Actually, the Cabot-Koppers Site is actually two sites. They're located at the corner at the intersection of 23rd Avenue, Northwest 23rd Avenue, and North Main Street in Gainesville.
And those sites are contiguous?
Yes, they're separated basically by a railroad track, but they're basically side by side.
Why don't we split these two sites up for a moment, and can you tell me a little bit about the history of the Koppers site?
Yes, the Koppers site has had a history of being a location where wood preserving has gone on, and wood preserving functions have been going on there since about the 1916 or so. So it's a fairly old site, and the wood preserving was being done with a variety of different chemicals during that time, and the issue there at the Koppers site is predominantly that they used to have a number of lagoons in which they used to discharge wastewater from their processes, their wood preserving processes.
And are we talking about primarily telephone poles here, or?
Yes, utility poles and telephone poles.
Okay.
Yeah, those types of.
And when was the property listed as a Superfund site?
The Koppers site was listed along with the Cabot site in 1983 by USEPA. It was put on the Superfund list.
And then it was sold at some point in its history, is that correct?
Yes, the Koppers site was, the Koppers company was basically bought by a company called Beazer out of the United Kingdom. And after a few years, Beazer basically sold the wood treating operations, including this particular Koppers plant, back to a team of Koppers management. So it went from being in Koppers to Beazer and then back to an independent company called Koppers.
And Beazer hung on to something, though, is that correct?
Yes, Beazer hung on to the environmental liabilities that are associated with that site. And I think that was part of the agreement that they had with Koppers to be able to, for the management to buy the company back from Beazer.
Interesting. So in spite of the fact that it's back with Koppers now, the discussion that's going on about cleanup continues to be with Beazer.
Yes, Beazer East is what's called the principal responsible party for that site.
Tell me more about the main environmental concerns, and let's stick with just the Koppers site.
Okay. The main environmental concerns at the Koppers site is there are wood preserving chemicals in the soils and in the groundwater at the site. And the chemicals, the wood preserving chemicals, have basically migrated down to, in the soils, to maybe 65 feet, and they've actually made it down into the groundwater, and in particular the Florida aquifer, down to 150 to 200 feet. So that is the main environmental issue at that site. The wood preserving chemicals have a variety of different chemicals in them. In particular, things that the audience might be familiar with would be like things like arsenic and creosote, which is kind of a wood preserving chemical, and those types of chemicals.
And John, there's been some discussion in the paper and in public recently about concerns about the soil itself and dust.
Right. That's been a concern about the site. There are areas on the copper site, especially the former processing areas, where there are higher levels of these particular chemicals in the soils. There are lower levels throughout the site, in the dust throughout the site. In particular, arsenic, and there was concern about dioxin. We locally became concerned and raised some concern with EPA when the concentration of some of these chemicals near the boundaries of the site, especially to the west and to the east, were higher than what the state of Florida sets as guidelines for clean sites.
And John, if you would, let's continue the history lesson, but switch over to the Cabot's site.
Okay.
Tell us about the history of that site.
The Cabot site was basically a site where they produced pine tar and charcoal. So it was a different type of operation. They basically took pine trees and cooked them in retorts, and basically distilled out the pine oils, and then they also got a residue, which was the pine tar. And the site was operated from the late 40s by the Cabot Corporation, and primarily they produced pine tar for the U.S. Navy for use on their ships.
And did that become a Superfund site at the same time as
Yes,
the
about the
copper
same
site?
time, about 1983.
John, what happened after these sites were designated Superfund sites?
Well, on both sites, there was an initial investigation done by the USEPA and by the state of Florida at that time to see what the contamination was. They believed that they had assessed the sites significantly. They came up with a remedial plan in 1990, which basically says this is what we're going to do to clean up the site. On both sites, they put in systems to collect the shallow groundwater, to collect it and to keep the shallow contaminated groundwater from moving off site. However, nothing really was done on Koppers as far as the soils on that site. On the Cabot site, the contamination wasn't quite as severe, so the soils were not considered to be an issue of concern. It was mainly a groundwater issue.
And is this the time that the drainage ditches were addressed also?
Right. On the Cabot site, one of the reasons it got listed as a Superfund site was the Cabot sold the property, and the property was developed as a shopping center in the late 70s, in the early 70s. And after the development of the shopping center, there was sort of a malodorous leachate, kind of a real smelly liquid that began to leach out of the ground and flow into the ditch along Main Street. That was the first signal that there was something wrong at the site. And so what was installed was a sort of a collection sump system along Main Street that currently operates now, that basically collects the contaminated groundwater from the Cabot site.
Okay, now you mentioned that plan began in 1990. Is EPA actually performing that cleanup still currently, or the investigation of that?
Well, one of the frustrations about the site is it has taken so long to make progress on the site. EPA doesn't actually do the work on the site. The actual technical work is being done by Beazer through their consultants, and by the Cabot Corporation, to the extent that work needs to be done on Cabot by their consultant. That's sort of the way the EPA Superfund process works, in that if EPA can find a responsible party, usually the responsible party takes the responsibility financially to basically do the investigation and come up with a remedy under EPA's direction.
And what is the role of the county's EPA in this process?
Okay. Our role has been, over the last, say, 6 or 7 years, actually more than that, actually 10 years or more, has been mainly a kind of an oversight role and kind of a technical review role. Our department has spent a considerable amount of time reviewing the technical reports, making sure that Beazer and their consultants are coming up with conclusions that make sense as far as the local geology and our local knowledge of the local conditions. In addition, we've been able to critique some of the plans and provide some additional input and maybe stress some of the issues that are more of a local concern to us.
I see. Now, you mentioned the remedial plan that was put into place in 1990. And I think this is where perhaps the public gets confused sometimes.
Right.
Was that 1990 remedial plan ever completed?
No, it was not, and I think that's been the frustrating part about this, in that after they came up with the plan and they went out, Beezer went out to actually implement the plan in the field, what was found was conditions in the field were not the same as what the assumptions were. The contamination in the soil was deeper. That was the first thing. So they said, all right, we've got to go and change our plan here to basically address some of the deeper contamination. So they spent quite a number of years adjusting the plan and coming up with some new strategies. And in 2001, they had what's called an amended remedy that they brought forth and brought to the community. And even then, when they presented that remedy in 2001, there was quite a bit of input from the local community and a lot of really knowledgeable local technical experts who basically advised the EPA that they had maybe made some wrong assumptions concerning the geology of the site.
John, let's dig into that. I'm sorry for the pun.
Yes.
A lot of this centers around, I guess, some of the perhaps faulty assumptions that you're speaking of centered around the clay layer.
Right.
Explain the science of that.
Okay. The eastern portion of Alachua County is basically geology, to make things simple, that there's a superficial layer which is mainly goes down maybe 35 feet, that is kind of sandy in nature. And then below that there's layers that contain some clay. The assumption that was made by EPA was that this clay layer was rather a kind of a uniform, thick clay layer that underlain the copper site, and that any contamination in the surface zones would not be able to go through the clay and make it down into the deeper water aquifers.
And is there a shallower water source that sits on top of the clay?
There's the shallow, sort of the shallow groundwater, and then there's the deeper groundwater that's below in the lower clay zones.
I see.
And the assumption that was incorrect was that this was a uniform zone. When EPA began investigating after that 2001 meeting here in Gainesville, they found that, they had made a mistake. It was incorrect, that actually the contamination had actually migrated through that first clay layer and had actually made it down into the Florida aquifer.
I see. And did this mark a turning point in terms the EPA, the US EPA accepted these assumptions or adopted these?
Yes, that was a significant turning point in the project. And by basically agreeing to go back and investigate, which they did after 2001, they put in some deeper wells, they found this deeper contamination, and then once it was found, there was some additional work that was required to be done. One of the concerns that arose when they found the deeper contamination was, well, is this a threat to the well field? So Gainesville Regional Utilities and the City of Gainesville became concerned that this deeper contamination was now a potential threat to the Murphy well field. So this then caused EPA and Beezer to do some additional investigations, put in deeper wells, put in more wells on the boundary of the site to try to get a better handle as to what is really going on at the site.
So John, the contaminants, they have found some evidence that the contaminants have reached the aquifer. Is that correct?
That's correct.
But, and this is another point of perhaps some confusion, at least for me. The Murphy well fields, is water drawn directly from the aquifer for those well fields?
Right. Yes, the Murphy well field draws water from the Florida aquifer, but rather the deeper zones of the Florida aquifer.
I see.
Probably in the 200 to in the 300 foot zone below ground surface.
So you can have some evidence of contaminants in a certain at a certain level of the aquifer. That does not mean it has encroached on the section of the aquifer that the Murphy well field draws water from.
Correct. Correct.
I see.
Right now, there's no evidence that any of the contamination that's in the Florida aquifer on site has actually migrated beyond the boundary. So, there is no current threat, immediate threat to the Murphy well field, but it's more of a long-term that EPA would need to come up with a solution to keep this from becoming a threat to the well field.
Is there any evidence that it's moving in that direction?
Okay. Right now, there is no evidence that it's moving in that direction. As I said, it's basically there have been some wells installed on the boundary of the site in the direction of the well field, and those wells have been cleaned. So there's no evidence yet that it's moving in that direction. But there is potential for that.
So the good news is that there's no evidence that
Right.
it's there. Now what about, and that concerns, everyone who gets their drinking
Certainly.
water, or at least their water from the city of Gainesville. What about residents that are living in the general vicinity of the site? Is this groundwater contamination a source of concern for them, or
No.
should it be?
No, Mark, it's not right now. Most of the residents, if not all of the residents that live nearby, there may be a few that are not, basically are on city water. So they're not drawing their drinking water. And the few that might still be on well water, their wells are tested on a regular basis by the Alachua County Health Department, and there has not been any contamination found in their wells. So and recent data shows that the groundwater flow is toward the west, say toward the neighborhoods west of the copper site, that the contamination has not spread in that direction.
And just to touch base on the soils one more time for the residents that are living in the general area, is EPD going to be conducting any sampling from soils of the residents?
Well, we have asked, when we observed the levels of contamination that were at the boundary of the copper site, we basically raised some concern with the USEPA and recommended that they do some off-site sampling. To date, that plan is in the work. It has not been produced by Beezer. There will probably need to be some off-site sampling. Right now, the Alachua County is not planning on doing that sampling as of now. We're basically waiting for EPA to come up with a plan. This is something that Beezer has to do as part of their determining the risk of the site. We don't feel that right now, based on discussions with the Florida Health Department, who's looked at some of the numbers on site, that there's really kind of an immediate, kind of a short-term risk right now to residents. Well, the concern would be long-term and making sure that there's no lingering long-term contamination in the soils in the neighborhood. So that's a question that's still to be resolved. We don't know what the contaminants are. We don't know if there is a threat, but it needs to be investigated.
Now, John, at the meeting that took place last week, both the City Commission, the County Commission, and many residents in the room expressed their frustration, to say the least, in this 25-year process. What is occurring now at the sites, and based on this meeting, where is this process heading in terms of reaching a final solution, if there is such a thing?
Well, let's talk a little bit about what's happening now at the site. EPA has really expedited a lot of the activities and the work that's going on the site in the last couple of years. There are some pilot tests going on right now where they're testing out different types of technologies that might be used to contain the contamination and to treat the contamination to keep it from migrating. Those pilot tests are going on right now. Other tests are being used to actually withdraw or to extract the contamination from the soil. In addition to that, EPA is finishing up a number of the investigations off-site, making sure that they've identified where the contamination is going. All this is headed toward coming up with a remedial plan, which EPA, right now, the schedule is EPA plans to have available by January of 2009. But in order to get there, they have to complete a number of studies. They have to complete what's called the risk assessment, which is what is the risk and what are the cleanup criteria that are going to be used on the site. I think the local residents and the city and the county commission they're very interested in knowing, in making sure they know what the cleanup standards are going to be at the site. That's one issue that came up at the meeting on May the 1st.
And will they first learn about that when the plan is unveiled in January?
No, we should have a pretty good idea before that, as these plans are usually put out in draft form, and they're usually sent out for comment by county staff and by GRU and by the state. So we as staff are going to know pretty much which direction and what numbers are being looked at by EPA. So we'll have an opportunity to make our views known if we disagree or if we have concerns about some of the criteria that are being put out there.
And is the January date you mentioned the time when that plan will be approved, or is that the time when it's unveiled and then there's a longer process?
That's the time when it's unveiled by EPA as kind of an official document that says, this is what we plan to do. There is a public comment period, usually after that, a 30 to 60 day public comment period in which they will accept comments from the public, all right?
Do you anticipate another meeting like the one we just had?
Yes, I would. Yes, what will happen is that EPA will be back probably locally and have another meeting, probably in January or so, where they, once the plan come out, to explain the plan to the community and to receive public input. I think, though, the point to make is, while you can make comments at that time, it's important that we, the county staff, the city staff, GRU, and the state be involved early in the process, because many of these decisions are going to need to be made before you actually get to that planning stage where the plan is kind of unveiled.
Are there any ways for citizens to be involved prior to that January unveiling?
Okay. The citizens will be, we're trying to get as many of our reports, the technical reports, available to the citizens as possible, trying to get them online so that if we have people with technical expertise in the community, they can read some of the reports, and basically they can funnel some of the comments to us, okay, or to the city or to GRU, and then we'd be glad to take any of this input and evaluate it and basically send it up to EPA. So right now that's kind of the only way this comment, although people can contact EPA directly if they have concerns.
So theoretically, we've got a plan that's parties agree it is a good plan, and you all have had a chance to completely look it over. We've had this public hearing again. Once the plan is approved, what happens?
Okay. Once the plan is approved and it becomes an official legal document by EPA, then what EPA does, they take that plan and they give it to Beazer, and they say, this is what you have to do, go do it, all right?
Beazer and Cabot.
And Cabot.
Yes.
Now, Cabot has agreed to the 1990 plan pretty much, and it has implemented. So right now, we're not sure what additional work Cabot would need to do.
I see.
It's predominantly going to be a Koppers plan addressing the copper situation, although there may be some aspects of it that are for Cabot. But this is going to be a negotiated process between EPA and Beazer. If EPA's selection of remedies and what the technology that they pick and the steps that they require in the plan does not agree with what Beazer wants to do, Beazer has an opportunity to challenge that plan. So there may still need to be some negotiations at that point as to what actually gets done.
Is there, I'm afraid I'm going to put you on the spot here, and I don't mean to, but is there floating around out there any ballpark estimate of the kinds of dollars that will be needed to implement a plan?
I haven't seen anything recently about some of the things. If you go back to the 2001 proposed remedy at that time, there were 5 or 6 options that were looked at, and many of them were in the 10, 20, 30, $40 million range as far as implementation. So it's going to span a wide range of financial, and that's one of the issues that EPA is not the main issue, but it is one of the things that they look at after they look at all the technical requirements and what's going to be required to reduce the risk, and then they look at, okay, what's the most cost-effective way to get to get there. So it is going to be a very expensive remedy.
And if it was, 10, 20, 30, $40 million in 2001, and that was with some of the assumptions that proved to be incorrect. I guess the assumption would be that the new plan would be more expensive than that?
It could be. It just depends on what the remedies are that they select. I mean, you may have to put in more groundwater treatment since you're worried about the Floridan. The soil remedies may be similar to what they had before, since really that hasn't really changed all that much.
And the USEPD does not have its own funding that it will dedicate towards this cleanup, is that correct?
You mean the EPA?
EPA, I mean?
Yeah. No, the EPA's funding is rather limited right now for doing this kind of work. In the probably several years ago, 8-10 years ago, there was the Superfund. Superfund generated a lot of its money by a tax on chemical products and on petroleum products that were basically sold in the United States. This went into what was called a Superfund, and which was then used for EPA to use to clean up some of these sites. Gotcha. The funding has been reduced over the last few years for that process. So while EPA has some money available, they would have to prioritize how much of that they use for each of these sites. So they're going to want to make sure that the bulk of the funding is paid for by the responsible party as much as possible.
Gotcha. So, John, what does the Alachua County Environmental Protection Department see as a acceptable long-term remedy for this site?
Okay. Well, if you put it in a short-term basis, we want to look that the groundwater is protected, definitely our well field. So whatever remedy is put in place for groundwater has to be something that could protect our groundwater resources and keep our well field protected for a long time. Second is we'd like to see some of the soils and some of the contamination in the soil removed or stabilized so that it is no longer a threat either into the residents next door from dust or from direct contact. So we definitely would like to see some removal of the source material. And thirdly, we'd like to see the remedy put in place to where the site has some potential for future redevelopment, that it's not kind of a stigmatized site that has a stigma associated with it. They could be basically has some future as far as redevelopment.
And John, give us we're almost out of time, but give us a quick synopsis of what happened at the city-county meeting. What did the county commission vote on at that meeting?
Well, both the city and the county, let me back up. There were a number of issues raised by the citizens at that meeting concerning predominantly the operations at the copper site. There were some questions about dust, there were some questions about stormwater, and there was questions about noise at the site, as well as some of the Superfund, why it was taking so long. So both the county and the city basically passed motions to send a letter to Koppers requesting them to take some action to reduce dust from the site, use some kind of dust control measures. In addition, the county is taking a look at the applicability of some of our local codes, as far as are we preempted in terms of being able to use local codes for use on the Superfund site. And the city commission asked the city staff to take a look at the overall code compliance at the site in terms of noise and stormwater and dust.
And there was an issue also that the city voted on the zoning of the property?
Yes, that's right. The additional thing was that the city, looking long-term for that site, asked their staff to start the process of looking at potentially changing the future land use for that property. We're not quite sure where that's going to go, but they asked them to take a look at that process.
Well, John, this is certainly an issue that many of our residents will be watching closely, and appreciate the work that you and EPD do on this.
Thank you very much, Mark.
Thanks for joining us.
Appreciate it.
It was going to be the house of my dreams, but something went wrong.
It was the opportunity I've been dreaming of, but suddenly it was gone.
I dreamed of the day all barriers would be gone, but they're still there. I'm Ida Rawls. If discrimination is turning your dream into a nightmare, we can help. The Alachua County Equal Opportunity Division wants to make sure every citizen has the opportunity to follow their dreams. If you are a victim of discrimination based on any of these categories, we can help.